David tried reasoning with the HOA board, requesting a meeting to discuss their concerns and find compromises. His letters went unanswered. When he showed up at a public HOA meeting, he was told that only residents could participate in discussions. He could observe silently, but he couldn't speak or ask questions. Watching from the back of the room, David listened as Patricia Chen outlined what she called the final phase of community enhancement. The HOA was planning a beautification project that would install decorative fencing around the entire perimeter of Willowbrook Estates. The fence would create clear boundaries and enhance the community's visual appeal. The fence design was elaborate and expensive. Wrought iron panels 6 feet high with decorative elements and automated gates at key access points. The project would be funded through a special assessment on all homeowners, but Patricia assured the audience it would significantly increase property values. David felt a chill as he realized the implications. If the HOA built a fence around their entire perimeter, it would completely surround his ranch. He'd be trapped inside their boundaries, dependent on them for access to the main road. After the meeting, David approached Patricia in the parking lot. "That fence you're planning," he said, "it would cut off my access to my own property." Patricia smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "I'm sure we can work something out for your access needs. The HOA is always willing to be reasonable, with good neighbors who respect community standards." David understood the message clearly. Submit to their demands or lose access to his own land. The battle for his ranch was about to become a war. David woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. It was barely dawn, but through his bedroom window he could see the bright lights of construction vehicles moving around his property. His heart sank as he realized what was happening. The HOA hadn't waited for community input or given him any notice. They were building the fence. He threw on clothes and ran outside, his bare feet slipping on the dew-covered grass. What he saw made his blood run cold. A crew of at least a dozen workers was already setting fence posts along the entire perimeter of his ranch. Massive trucks sat along the road, loaded with sections of ornate iron fencing. A supervisor with a clipboard was directing the operation like a military campaign. "Hey!" David called out as he ran toward the crew. "What's going on here? This is my property line." The supervisor, a heavy-set man in a hard hat, barely looked up from his clipboard. "We're working on the HOA side of the property line, sir. You'll need to take any concerns up with them." David pulled out his phone and started taking pictures and videos. The workers were indeed staying on the HOA side of the boundary, but just barely. They were building the fence right up against his property line, so close that the posts were only inches from his own fencing. As the morning progressed, David watched in growing horror as his world literally closed in around him. The fence sections were 6 feet tall and solid, blocking his view of the road and the neighborhood beyond. The ornate ironwork was beautiful in its own way, but to David it looked like the bars of a prison. By noon, the workers had completed 3 sides of the fence. David realized they were saving the side facing the main road for last. That was his only access point to the outside world. Once they finished that section, he'd be completely surrounded. David called the county planning office, hoping to find some regulation that would stop the construction. But the HOA had done their homework. All the permits were in order. The fence was on their property, built to code, and they had every legal right to construct it. "But they're cutting off my access to the public road," David explained to the clerk. "Do you have a legal easement for access across their property?" the clerk asked. David's heart sank. "I've always just used the main road. My property touches the road directly." "Then they can't legally block your access to the road itself. But if they're building on their own property, there's nothing we can do to stop them." David hung up and walked to where the crew was working on the road-facing section. His worst fears were confirmed. They were installing a single gate exactly where his driveway met the main road. The gate was elaborate, with an electronic lock system and what looked like a card reader. The supervisor was back, double-checking measurements. David approached him again. "That gate," David said, pointing to the installation. "How am I supposed to get in and out of my own property?" "You'll need to contact the HOA for access procedures," the supervisor replied without looking up. Just here to build what's on the plans. Access procedures, this is my home. I can't ask permission every time I need to leave my own property. The supervisor finally looked at David and his expression was almost sympathetic. Look, I just build fences. I don't make the rules. But you might want to talk to whoever hired us before this gets finished. David spent the rest of the day on the phone trying to reach someone from the HOA board. Patricia Chen's office said she was in meetings all day. The property management company said they'd have someone call him back. No one called back. By evening, the fence was complete. David stood in his front yard and turned in a slow circle, taking in his new reality. His 40 acres were now surrounded by 6 feet of iron fencing. The only way in or out was through a single gate that he had no way to open. As if to emphasize his situation, David heard his phone ring. It was Tom Bradley who boarded 2 horses at David's ranch. Hey David, I'm running late, but I'll be by around 7 to check on Storm. He seemed a little off yesterday. David's stomach dropped. Tom, we might have a problem. The HOA built a fence around my property today and I'm not sure I can get the gate open. There was silence on the other end of the line. What do you mean they built a fence? Around your property? David explained the situation while walking toward the gate. It was an impressive piece of engineering with heavy iron panels and what looked like a sophisticated locking mechanism. There was a small sign that read, "Authorized access only, Contact Management Office." This is insane, Tom said. They can't just lock you in your own property, can they? David didn't have an answer. He tried pulling on the gate, pushing it, looking for any manual override. Nothing worked. The lock was electronic and completely secure. Tom arrived 20 minutes later and parked outside the gate. David could see him through the iron bars, but they might as well have been on different planets. Tom tried helping from his side, but the gate was designed to keep people out, not to be opened from either side without proper authorization. I've got to check on Storm, Tom said. Can you climb over? David looked up at the 6-foot fence. He was in good shape for his age, but climbing over iron fencing wasn't something he'd planned to make a regular part of his routine. With Tom's help, he managed to get over the gate, though he scraped his arm on the decorative spikes at the top. Storm was fine, but getting back to his own property required another undignified climb over the fence. David's shirt was torn and his arm was bleeding by the time he made it back to his own side. That night, David barely slept. Every sound made him think about emergency situations. What if there was a fire? What if one of his animals was injured and needed immediate veterinary care? What if he had a medical emergency himself? The fence wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a serious safety hazard. The next morning brought a new humiliation. David's regular feed delivery was scheduled for 8 a.m. He watched from his kitchen window as the truck pulled up to the gate and sat there, engine running. After a few minutes, the driver got out and examined the gate, looking for some way to open it. David ran outside and called out to the driver, a man named Pete who'd been delivering feed to the ranch for 5 years. Hey Pete, I'm here, but I can't get the gate open. The HOA installed this yesterday. Pete walked over to the fence, shaking his head. This is crazy, David. How am I supposed to make deliveries? I can't carry 50-pound feed bags over this fence. David had no answer. Pete tried calling his dispatch office to see if they had any solutions, but the delivery company had no protocol for situations like this. After an hour of trying to figure out alternatives, Pete had to leave with the feed still on his truck. By 10 a.m., David's phone was ringing constantly. The veterinarian's office calling to confirm an appointment for horse vaccinations. The farrier, who was scheduled to shoe 3 horses that afternoon. 2 horse owners who wanted to visit their animals. A potential new customer who was supposed to tour the facilities. David had to cancel everything. He tried explaining the situation, but it sounded insane even to him. I'm sorry, but the homeowners association built a fence around my property, and I can't get the gate open. The responses were predictable: confusion, disbelief, and in some cases, anger. The veterinarian's office charged a cancellation fee. The farrier, who had driven 40 minutes to get there, was not happy about wasting his morning. 2 horse owners threatened to move their animals to other facilities if David couldn't guarantee access. Around noon, David called the HOA management office again. This time, he managed to get through to a representative who sounded like she was reading from a script. Mr. Davidson, the community access protocols are designed to maintain security and preserve the peaceful enjoyment of all residents. If you need access, you can submit a request through our online portal. The morning sun painted the Texas sky orange as David walked across his 40 acres, checking on the animals before the day got too hot. His boots crunched on the gravel path he'd laid down himself, stone by stone, over the past 15 years. This wasn't just land to him. It was home. It was freedom. It was everything he'd worked for since he was old enough to dream. David had bought this patch of scrubland back when it seemed like the middle of nowhere. The realtor had tried to talk him out of it, saying it was too far from town, too rough, too much work for one man. But David saw something different. He saw potential. He saw a place where he could build something with his own hands, something that belonged to him completely. The first few years were tough, really tough. David lived in a small trailer while he cleared the land, pulling up mesquite trees and hauling away rocks. His hands were always cut up, his back always sore. But every evening, when he sat on his little porch and looked out over the land, he knew he was building something special. He started small. A few chickens first, then some goats. The animals helped clear the brush while giving him fresh eggs and milk. David learned everything from YouTube videos and old farming books he found at garage sales. How to build proper fencing, how to dig a well, how to plant crops that would actually grow in the Texas heat. The breakthrough came in year 3 when he got his first horse, a beautiful mare named Luna that a neighbor was selling cheap because she was getting too old to ride. David didn't know much about horses then, but Luna was patient with him. She taught him as much as any book could. Soon, other horse owners in the area started asking if he could board their animals. David's pastures were greener than most. His care was careful and kind. Word spread the way it does in small communities. David's place became known as somewhere you could trust your animals. Horse owners drove from 3 counties over to board their horses with him. He built proper stables, installed automatic watering systems, and created separate pastures for different animals. The money from boarding helped him expand even more. By year 7, David was running a proper ranch. He had 20 horses in his care, a small herd of cattle, and enough chickens to sell eggs at the local farmer's market every Saturday. He'd built a workshop where he repaired equipment and crafted custom saddles. The trailer was long gone, replaced by a modest but comfortable house he'd built himself with help from friends. The land around him started changing around year 8. David began seeing surveyors walking around the empty fields next to his property. Then came the bulldozers. A development company had bought up hundreds of acres surrounding his ranch. They were building something called Willowbrook Estates, a planned community with big houses and perfect lawns. At first, David worried they might try to force him out. Developers had a reputation for that kind of thing. But when the sales representatives came by, they were surprisingly friendly. They explained that his ranch would actually be a selling point for their community. Buyers liked the idea of living next to authentic Texas ranch land. They even put it in their marketing materials. Experience country living with the convenience of modern amenities. The construction took 2 years. David watched from his porch as the houses went up, row after row of similar designs in neutral colors. Each house had a small yard, a 2-car garage, and what the signs called maintenance-free living. The residents started moving in gradually, and David made an effort to be neighborly. Most of the new neighbors seemed nice enough. They'd wave when they drove by on the main road. Some stopped to ask about the horses or to buy fresh eggs. Kids from the neighborhood would come by after school to pet the animals through the fence, their parents following behind with cameras to capture the moment. David even became something of a local attraction. The horses were beautiful, especially in the early morning when the mist was still rising from the pastures. Photographers would ask permission to take pictures for wedding shoots or family portraits. David usually said yes as long as they respected the animals and cleaned up after themselves. The relationship with Willowbrook Estates stayed friendly for nearly a decade. David knew most of his neighbors by name. He'd helped several of them when storms knocked down trees or when they needed someone to watch their pets during vacations. When the community newsletter featured local businesses, They always included a nice article about David's ranch. The homeowners association seemed reasonable in those early years. They focused on maintaining the common areas and organizing community events. David was invited to their annual barbecue and holiday parties, though he usually preferred to stay home with the animals. The HOA president, a retired teacher named Robert, would stop by occasionally just to chat about the weather or local news. David took pride in keeping his property clean and well-maintained. His fences were straight and sturdy. His buildings were painted and in good repair. The pastures were healthy and green, a result of careful land management and rotation schedules he'd learned through trial and error. He composted his animal waste properly and planted trees along the property lines to provide shade and wind protection. The ranch supported itself and then some. Between boarding fees, egg sales, and the occasional horse training contract, David made a decent living. More importantly, he woke up every morning excited about the day ahead. There was always something that needed doing, always an animal that needed attention, always a project that could be improved. His favorite time was early evening when the work was done and he could sit on his porch with a cold drink. The horses would graze peacefully in the fading light. The chickens would scratch around in their pen. The cattle would gather under the oak trees he'd planted years ago. It was quiet, except for the natural sounds of animals and wind through the grass. David often thought about how different his life might have been if he'd taken a safer path. He could have stayed in the city, worked in an office, lived in an apartment. But sitting there on his porch watching the sun set over land he'd transformed with his own hands, he knew he'd made the right choice. This was where he belonged. This was home. Looking back, those were the golden years. David had found the perfect balance between solitude and community, between hard work and peaceful satisfaction. He had no way of knowing that changes were coming to Willowbrook Estates. Changes that would test everything he'd built and force him to fight for the land he loved. The first sign something was changing came in David's mailbox on a Tuesday morning in March. A letter from the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, but not the usual friendly newsletter he was used to receiving. This one was formal, typed on official letterhead, and signed by someone named Patricia Chen, who apparently was the new HOA president. David read the letter twice, trying to make sense of it. The HOA was implementing new community standards to preserve property values and maintain the aesthetic integrity of Willowbrook Estates. The letter went on to explain that while David's ranch wasn't technically part of the HOA, his property was visually connected to the community and therefore subject to certain guidelines. The guidelines were extensive. No farm animals within 200 feet of any property line. No outdoor storage of equipment or feed. No signs advertising commercial activities. Fencing must be architecturally compatible with the community aesthetic. The letter concluded by informing David that he had 30 days to bring his property into compliance or face appropriate action. David set the letter down and looked out at his ranch. Everything he saw violated at least one of these new rules. His horse barn was only 50 feet from the property line. His hay storage shed was clearly visible from several houses. His simple, wooden sign advertising Twin Creek Ranch horseboarding had been up for 8 years without complaint. That evening, David drove over to Robert's house. The former HOA president was working in his garden when David pulled up. "Hey there, David, been a while. How are the horses doing?" "They're fine, Robert. But I got this letter today from the new HOA. Thought maybe you could help me understand what's going on." Robert's face darkened as he read the letter. He shook his head slowly. "I was afraid something like this might happen. Patricia and her group took over the board last month. They've got some pretty strong opinions about how things should be run. But my ranch has been here longer than most of these houses. How can they suddenly decide I'm not in compliance with rules that didn't exist when I moved here?" That's what I tried to tell them, but they're not interested in how things used to be. They want everything to look like a magazine picture. Patricia moved here from some fancy development in California. She's used to strict HOA control. Robert explained that the new board had been elected by a margin of just 12 votes. Many longtime residents hadn't bothered to vote, assuming things would continue as they always had. Patricia's campaign had focused on protecting property, values and eliminating incompatible land uses in the surrounding area. The thing is, Robert continued, they can't actually enforce these rules on your property. You're not part of the HOA, but they can make your life difficult in other ways. David found out exactly what Robert meant over the next few weeks. The county code enforcement office suddenly became very interested in his ranch. Inspectors showed up to examine his septic system, his well water, and his animal housing facilities. Each inspection required David to take time off from his work to meet with officials who seemed to be looking for violations rather than ensuring compliance. The inspections were thorough and disruptive. David had to move animals around to give inspectors access. He had to dig up records and permits going back 15 years. Every small issue became a formal citation requiring written responses and follow-up visits. A missing permit for a tool shed he'd built 5 years ago. A fence post that was allegedly 2 inches closer to the road than allowed. A manure pile that was supposedly visible from a public right-of-way. None of the violations were serious, but each one required time and money to resolve. David had to hire a surveyor to verify his fence lines. He had to pay for new permits and inspections. He had to move buildings and storage areas to satisfy complaints that had never been raised before. The harassment escalated when the HOA started organizing what they called community improvement initiatives. They hired a landscaping company to enhance the area along David's property line. Without asking permission or giving notice, workers showed up and began planting ornamental trees and shrubs right up against David's fence. The new plantings blocked David's view of the road and created problems for his animals. Horses are curious creatures, and several of them got sick from eating the decorative plants, which turned out to be toxic to livestock. David had to call the veterinarian twice and pay for expensive treatments. When David complained to the HOA, Patricia Chen's response was dismissive. The landscaping was on HOA property, she explained, and they had every right to plant whatever they wanted. If David's animals were getting sick, perhaps he should consider better containment systems. The phone calls started around the same time. Anonymous complaints to the county about noise, smells, and unsanitary conditions at David's ranch. Each complaint triggered another inspection, another disruption, another set of forms to fill out and fees to pay. David's roosters had been crowing at sunrise for 10 years without complaint. Suddenly, the county received multiple noise violations about excessive and disturbing animal sounds, beginning before 6 a.m. David had to research local ordinances and provide documentation that his animals were grandfathered under agricultural use provisions. The smell complaints were particularly frustrating. David managed his ranch responsibly, composting waste and maintaining clean facilities. But complaints kept coming in about noxious odors and unsanitary practices. Inspectors would arrive on windy days when the natural smells of hay and animals carried farther than usual. David began to realize that his new neighbors weren't just complaining about genuine problems. They were systematically trying to make his life difficult enough that he'd choose to leave. The complaints were too frequent, too coordinated, and too focused on normal ranch activities that had never been issues before. The pressure campaign intensified when the HOA started hosting community meetings to discuss incompatible land uses in the area. David wasn't invited to these meetings, but neighbors who supported him would fill him in afterward. Patricia Chen would present slideshows about property values and community standards, always featuring photos of David's ranch as examples of what needed to be addressed. The meetings generated more complaints and more pressure on county officials to take action. David found himself spending hours every week dealing with bureaucracy instead of caring for his animals. The constant stress began to affect his health and his business. Some horse owners, concerned about the ongoing disputes, moved their animals to other facilities. Requests are typically processed within 24 to 48 hours. 24 to 48 hours? David couldn't believe what he was hearing. I need to get to my job. I have animals that need care. This is my home. I understand your concerns, sir. However, the access system is in place for the safety and security of the entire community. If you have an emergency, you can call our emergency number and we'll dispatch someone with access authorization. David asked for the emergency number and was told it was only available to community residents. Since he wasn't technically part of the HOA, he didn't qualify for emergency access privileges. The absurdity of the situation hit David like a physical blow. He was a prisoner on his own land, surrounded by neighbors who had decided he didn't belong in their perfect community. But as he stood there looking at the fence that had changed his life overnight, David felt something besides despair. He felt anger, and with the anger came determination. If the HOA wanted to play games with his property rights, David was ready to play, but he was going to play by his own rules. David spent the first week after the fence went up feeling like a caged animal. Every morning he woke up hoping it had all been a bad dream, only to see those iron bars surrounding his world. But by the second week, his initial shock and anger had transformed into something more useful. Cold, calculated determination. He started by calling every attorney in the county who dealt with property law. Most of them listened politely and told him the same thing. If the HOA built the fence on their own property, there wasn't much he could do about it. But one lawyer, an older woman named Carol Rodriguez, seemed genuinely interested in his case. "The situation you're describing is unusual," Carol said during their first meeting. "It's one thing to restrict access across private property, but completely surrounding someone's land raises some interesting legal questions. I'd like to research this before we decide how to proceed." Carol's research took 3 weeks, during which David's life became increasingly difficult. The HOA had graciously provided him with temporary access privileges that allowed him to request gate openings twice per day, once in the morning and once in the evening. Each request required 24-hour advance notice and cost $50. The restrictions were devastating to David's business. Horse owners couldn't visit their animals spontaneously. Veterinary emergencies required expensive emergency access fees of $200. Feed deliveries had to be scheduled days in advance and coordinated through the HOA management office. Several customers gave up and moved their horses elsewhere. But the forced isolation also gave David time to think. And the more he thought about the situation, the more questions he had about the land itself. How had the HOA been able to surround his property so completely? Usually properties had multiple access points or shared easements with neighbors. The fact that they could cut him off so easily suggested something unusual about the property boundaries. David started digging through his old paperwork, looking for the original land surveys and deeds. What he found puzzled him. His property was described as Parcel 7 of the original Thompson Homestead, but the survey map showed his land extending further east than he'd realized. According to the documents, his property line actually cut across part of what was now Willowbrook Estates. When Carol called with her research results, David was ready with questions of his own. "I found some interesting precedents for your situation," Carol began. "There are several cases where courts have ruled that completely surrounding someone's property constitutes a form of imprisonment, even if done on private land. But before we go down that road, I think we need to get a current survey done. I want to make absolutely sure where your property lines actually are." David explained what he'd found in his old paperwork. Carol's interest sharpened immediately. "You're saying your deed might extend into the HOA's development? That changes everything. If there's any question about the property boundaries, we need to resolve that before we can address the fence issue." Carol recommended a surveyor she'd worked with before, a meticulous man named Frank Riley who specialized in resolving boundary disputes. Frank agreed to do the work immediately, partly because he was curious about the case and partly because the HOA's complete confidence in their property lines struck him as suspicious. "In my experience," Frank told David, "when someone builds a fence right up to a property line without any buffer zone, they're either very sure of their boundaries or they're trying to hide something." Frank's initial survey took 2 days. He used GPS equipment, metal detectors, and historical records to locate the original survey markers that had been placed when the land was first divided. What he found was remarkable. "David," Frank said, spreading his survey maps across David's kitchen table, "your property extends almost 100 feet further east than anyone realized. And it includes a very interesting piece of land." Frank pointed to an area on the map that David recognized immediately. It was the site of Willowbrook Estates Community Center, a large building that housed the HOA offices, a fitness center, and meeting rooms. According to Frank's survey, the entire building sat on land that belonged to David. "Are you sure about this?" David asked, hardly believing what he was seeing. "I've checked it 3 times with different methods. The original survey markers are still there, buried under landscaping and pavement, but still there. This building is definitely on your property." Carol's reaction was even more dramatic. When David called to tell her about Frank's findings, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "David, do you understand what this means? That community center isn't just any building. It's where the HOA keeps all their records, their management offices, and their master keys. If that building is on your property, you own it." But proving ownership wasn't going to be simple. The land had changed hands multiple times over the decades, and there had been several administrative errors along the way. The original Thompson homestead had been divided into parcels in the 1950s, but some of the paperwork had been lost in a courthouse fire in the 1970s. When the development company bought the surrounding land, they had relied on incomplete records. Carol explained that David would need to file a quiet title action, a legal proceeding to establish his ownership of the disputed land. It would require extensive research into property records, interviews with longtime residents, and potentially a court trial. "The good news," Carol said, "is that your original deed is very clear about the boundaries. The bad news is that the HOA and the development company have been operating as if they own that land for over 15 years. They're not going to give it up without a fight." David's research became an obsession. He spent hours at the county courthouse digging through old records and maps. He tracked down retired county employees who remembered the original land divisions. He found aerial photographs from the 1940s that showed the original Thompson homestead, before it was subdivided. The story that emerged was fascinating. The Thompson family had owned over 300 acres in the area since the 1890s. The original farmhouse, built in 1892, still stood. It was now the centerpiece of the Willowbrook Estates Community Center. When Old Man Thompson died in 1953, his will had divided the land among his children, but the executor had made errors in describing the boundaries. David's grandfather had bought one of the parcels in 1954, but the deed description didn't match the actual survey. Over the years, as properties changed hands and were subdivided further, the errors had been compounded. The development company had eventually assumed ownership of the disputed area simply because no one had challenged them. "It's actually a common problem with older properties," Carol explained. "Boundary disputes can lie dormant for decades until something like your situation brings them to light." The most damaging evidence came from an unlikely source. While researching property tax records, David discovered that the county had been sending tax bills for the disputed land to 2 different addresses, his ranch and the HOA management company. Both had been paying taxes on the same piece of property for over a decade. "This is actually perfect for our case," Carol said when David showed her the tax records. "It proves that even the county recognized the boundary confusion. And the fact that you've been paying taxes on that land strengthens your ownership claim." As David's case developed, word began spreading through Willowbrook Estates that their community center might not actually belong to them. Some residents were outraged, insisting that David was trying to steal their property. But others, particularly longtime residents who remembered the old Thompson place, began to have doubts about the HOA's version of events. The turning point came when David found the original survey stakes from 1892. They were buried under decades of soil and landscaping, but Frank's metal detector located them exactly where the historical records said they should be. The stakes proved conclusively that David's property extended well into what was now considered HOA land. Carol filed the quiet title action on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, David's phone was ringing constantly. Patricia Chen was demanding meetings. The HOA's lawyers were threatening countersuits. Property management companies were scrambling to understand how their records could have been so wrong. But David wasn't interested in meetings or threats. He had spent weeks trapped behind a fence, treated like a trespasser on his own land. Now he had something the HOA needed: legal ownership of their most important building. And with that building came something even more valuable: the master. Key storage room where the HOA kept access codes and keys for every gate, every building, and every common area in Willowbrook Estates. For the first time since the fence went up, David smiled. The tables were about to turn. David's quiet title action moved through the courts faster than anyone expected. Carol had done her homework thoroughly, and the evidence was overwhelming. Historical surveys, tax records, and the original survey, stakes all pointed to the same conclusion. David owned the land where the Willowbrook Estates Community Center stood. The HOA's lawyers tried every argument they could think of. They claimed adverse possession, arguing that the HOA had used the land openly for 15 years. But adverse possession requires that the original owner had knowledge of the encroachment and failed to act. David's family had been paying taxes on the land the entire time, and previous owners had simply been unaware of the exact boundaries. They tried arguing that David was engaging in legal harassment, but the court found that claim ridiculous. David hadn't asked for anything except to be left alone on his own property. The HOA had created the conflict by building the fence. Most desperately, they offered to buy the disputed land from David for 10 times its assessed value. But David wasn't interested in money. He was interested in justice. The court's decision came down on a Tuesday morning in November. Judge Martinez ruled that David was the rightful owner of approximately 2 acres that included the entire community center complex. The HOA had 30 days to vacate the building or begin paying rent to David as a tenant. Patricia Chen's reaction was swift and predictable. She called an emergency board meeting and announced that the HOA would appeal the decision. In the meantime, they would continue operating as if nothing had changed. David's property rights could wait for the appeals process. But Carol had anticipated this response. She had already filed for immediate possession of the property, arguing that David needed access to his own land. The judge agreed and issued an order giving David immediate legal possession of the community center. David's next move surprised everyone, including Carol. Instead of trying to evict the HOA immediately, he drove to the community center on Wednesday morning with a locksmith and his attorney. They weren't there to kick anyone out. They were there to exercise David's rights as the property owner. The scene at the community center was surreal. Patricia Chen and 2 other board members were in the main office, frantically copying files and making phone calls to their attorneys. The fitness center was full of residents who had no idea their morning workout was about to be interrupted. The pool area hummed with maintenance activity. David walked calmly to the main office and knocked on the door. Patricia looked up from her desk, her face a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You can't be here," she said. "This is private property." "Actually," David replied, holding up the court order, "this is my private property, and I'm here to take possession of what belongs to me." The locksmith went to work immediately, changing the locks on the main entrance and the office doors. Carol served Patricia with formal notice that she was now a tenant on David's property and would need to negotiate a lease agreement if she wanted to continue using the space. But David's real objective wasn't the offices or the fitness center. He was heading for the security control room where the HOA kept the master access system for the entire community. The room was tucked away in the basement of the building, behind a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The locksmith made quick work of that door too. Inside, David found exactly what he'd hoped for: a sophisticated computer system that controlled every electronic lock in Willowbrook Estates, gate access codes, building keys, pool locks, mailbox keys. Everything was controlled from this room, and there, in a secure cabinet, were the physical backup keys for every system in the community, including the master key for the gate that had imprisoned David on his own property for the past 2 months. David picked up the gate key and turned it over in his palm. Such a small thing to have caused so much trouble. He slipped it into his pocket and turned to Carol. "I think it's time to open that gate." Word spread through Willowbrook Estates like wildfire. Residents gathered at their windows and came out of their houses to watch as David walked to the main gate with the master key. Some looked angry, others curious. A few actually seemed amused. By the turn of events, David inserted the key and turned it. The electronic lock disengaged with a quiet click. The gate swung open easily as if it had never been locked at all. For the first time in 2 months, David walked freely from his own property to the public road. The simple act of crossing that threshold felt like a victory, but David knew the real battle was just beginning. Patricia Chen appeared at the gate within minutes, flanked by several board members and what looked like a private security guard. "You're trespassing on community property," Patricia announced. "I'm calling the police." David held up the court order. "This gate is on my property and I have every rig to control access to my own land, but I'm prepared to be reasonable." The police arrived 20 minutes later, but after reviewing David's court order and listening to both sides, they confirmed that David was within his rights. The gate was indeed on his property, and he could control access as he saw fit. That's when David made his offer. "I don't want to disrupt your community," he told the gathered crowd. "I just want to live peacefully on my ranch. Here's what I propose. Remove the fence entirely and I'll grant the HOA a permanent easement to use the community center building for a nominal fee of $1 per year." The crowd murmured as people processed this unexpected offer. Patricia looked like she was about to explode. "Remove the fence? Do you have any idea how much that fence cost? How much it means to our property values?" "I know exactly how much it cost," David replied calmly, "because I've been the one paying the price for it. Every day for 2 months I've been a prisoner on my own land because you decided I didn't fit your vision of the perfect community." David's voice carried across the crowd and several residents nodded in agreement. Not everyone had supported the fence project, but they'd been outvoted by Patricia's faction. "The fence comes down, or the community center stays locked," David continued. "Those are your options. You can file all the appeals you want, but right now, today, I control access to your offices, your records, and your meeting spaces." Patricia tried to rally support from the crowd, but the residents were doing their own calculations. The community center was essential to their lifestyle and their property values. The fitness center, the pool, the meeting rooms. Losing access to those amenities would be far more damaging than losing a decorative fence. The debate continued for hours. Emergency board meetings were called. Lawyers were consulted. Some residents threatened to sue David, while others praised him for standing up to what they saw as HOA overreach. By evening, a compromise was emerging. The fence would come down, but the HOA wanted David to pay for the removal costs. David countered that he'd pay half the removal costs in exchange for a written guarantee that his ranch activities would never again be subject to HOA interference. The negotiations took 3 more days, but eventually both sides reached an agreement. The fence would be removed at the HOA's expense. David would grant them a long-term lease on the community center for minimal rent. And most importantly, David's ranch would be permanently protected from future HOA actions through a detailed easement agreement. The fence removal began on a Saturday morning. David watched from his porch as the same crew that had built the fence worked to tear it down. Some residents gathered to watch too, though their reactions were mixed. Children from the neighborhood cheered as each section came down. Some adults looked sad to see their security barrier disappearing. By Sunday evening, the fence was gone. David's 40 acres were open to the world again. His horses grazed peacefully in pastures that were no longer surrounded by iron bars. The main road was visible from his front porch. Most importantly, David could come and go from his own property whenever he pleased. On Monday morning, David woke up early and walked across his land as he had done every morning for 15 years. But this morning felt different. He wasn't just checking on his animals and his property. He was savoring his freedom. His phone rang as he was feeding the horses. It was Tom Bradley, one of the horse owners who had stuck with David through the whole ordeal. "Hey, David, I wanted to bring Storm by for a visit this morning. What time works for you?" David smiled. "Anytime you want, Tom. The gate's always open." As David hung up the phone, he realized that was exactly how it should be. The gate was open, his ranch was thriving, and the community around him was learning to respect boundaries, both the legal kind and the human kind. He still had the master key to Willowbrook Estates in his workshop, though he'd never needed to use it again. Sometimes he'd take it out and look at it, remembering the day when such a small piece of metal had represented the difference between freedom and imprisonment. But mostly, David focused on the future. His ranch was busier than ever, with new customers who had heard about his story and wanted to support someone who'd stood up for his rights. The community center lease provided a small but steady income that helped with property improvements. Best of all, David's relationship with his neighbors had actually improved. The fence controversy had forced everyone to have honest conversations about community values and individual rights. Most residents had come to realize that David's ranch was an asset to their neighborhood, not a problem to be solved. The master key sat in David's workshop drawer, a reminder that sometimes the smallest tools can open the biggest doors. But the real key to David's victory hadn't been made of metal. It had been made of patience, determination, and the absolute refusal to give up on what was rightfully his.